Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and I hope that we will be learning today, Mirz Hashem, the remainder of Daf Dun Gimel Amud Beis, which is quite a bit of Mishnah Berurah, together with the majority of Nun Daled Amud Aleph. However, I will preface by saying that we're going to be learning some complex halachas today in the bottom of the Tefillin, and I hope we'll be able to cover as much ground as I'm hoping that we will. There are a lot of complexities over here that need a lot of explanation. So, as opposed to the way I normally do things, I'm going to give a rather lengthy hakdama today to today's halachas, and I'll try to cover in the hakdama a lot of the halachas that we are going to learn, so that when we learn it inside, it will go rather smoothly. Many of us are familiar with the idea that tefillin have to be miruba'os. What does that mean? It means that, to us, it means that the tefillin have to be square. Now, ask most people, go to most people in shul, and say, there's a halacha that the tefillin have to be miruba'os, they have to be square. What exactly does that mean, that the tefillin have to be square? I think the vast majority of people look at the halacha of miruba'os, and they think that what that means is that the length and the width of the bias have to be exactly the same. So that if we look at the tefillin from a bird's eye view, and we look at the top of the tefillin, this has to be a square. And most people also look at it and they say, well, it has to be merubais. Not only do we have to measure it as a square, but that the corners also have to be nice and sharp. And those are the two factors that I think most people, when you tell them, we speak to them about the need for tefillin to be merubais, that's what comes to their mind right away. That the actual bias of the tefillin, the top part of the tefillin that contains the parshiyos, have to be square. And when they think of it being square, they really think in terms of measuring the top of the bias. They measure one side, measure the other side, see that they're equal, and now the tefillin are square, and they know that the corners are supposed to be pointy, the corners are not supposed to be rounded. That's the way most people look at it. We're going to learn today the halachas of the requirement for the bottom to be merubais, and I think many people are going to be surprised at how complex this is. Now, what is the source of this halacha? So we have a brisa in Masechtas Menachos Lamed Hey Amud Aleph. The brisa says as follows: Tana, we learned in a brisa, tefillin miruba'os, the need for tefillin to be square. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So we really only have two words over here that tell us what the requirement is. Tefillin miruba'os. Tefillin have to be square. What does that mean? Which part of the tefillin? Doesn't say. Then we have right after that a mimer of Rav Papa. Some have the Girsa Rabba, some have the Girsa Rava. So we have an Amora over here coming to explain or add on, depending on how you learn Pshat in the Gemara, coming to add on or explain the brisa. It's either Rav Papa, Rabba, or Rava. And it says, Amar of Papa, when the brisa says Tefillin meruba'os, bitfaran ubala achsainon. It means in the stitching of the tefillin and on its diagonal. Okay? So far we have over here tefillin merubais, our halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and then we have the memra of an Amora, either of Papa, Rabba, or Rava, that says it means bitfaran, in the stitching of the tefillin, uba alach sainon, and on the diagonal of the tefillin. What precisely does this mean? This is a major machlokes rishonim, exactly how to understand this. Now, Rashi over here in Menachos, and there's a very similar Rashi in Masechtas Megillah that some who are learning Daf Yomi might remember from not all that long ago in Daf Yomi. Rashi says, Tefillin merubais b'toifron, the tefillin have to be square in their stitching. Says Rashi, b'tfirasan, when you stitch the bias of the tefillin, yishmar es ribuan, you have to make sure to protect the square nature of the tefillin. Shelo yimshay chut hatfira yoser midai, so that you should not pull the stitching too hard. shelo yikavtzu, so that you should not compact the tefillin, pull them in, v'yikatzer rachbai, and then narrow them. Shekarin dagarzalir in Balaz. Now, there's an interesting fact that I think is not very well known, and that is that Rashi's tefillin, we call our tefillin Rashi tefillin, but Rashi tefillin really would not look like our tefillin. See, when I'm holding my shalrosh over here, we have the bias that we call the ketzitza, right? That's this upper part that actually contains the parshias, and it's sitting on the titura, right? That's the foundation over here that comes out on three sides and then has the mabarta on the back. The titura is larger than the bias. Rashi did not make his tefillin that way. Rashi, the titura was flush with the bias. It didn't extend, not on the front, not on the sides. It only extended on the back for the mabarta, but it did not extend further than the bias on the other three sides. And the titura was actually stitched. There were holes in the bottom of the wall of the bias, and the stitching went through the walls of the bias down through the titura. Now, if you stitch the tefillin in that way, and you pull the stitching very hard, you might actually, especially if your tefillin are made out of dakas, if it's made out of thin leather from small animals like a sheep, not like we have gasses that are made out of the very, very stiff leather of a cow, if you would pull the stitching tight, it's very likely that you would pull it too tight and change the shape of the bias. It's like a drawstring. If you pull the stitching very hard, you'll pull in the wall of the bias and you might lose the ribua of the bias. So from Rashi, it seems very clear that when the Gemara, when the Brisa in Menachos says, Tefillin miruba'is halacha l'Moshe miSinai, that the need for tefillin to be square is a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, Rashi understands that to mean that the bias has to be square. When Rav Papa says betifran in the stitching, Rashi says, what does that mean? Since the bias has to be square, when you do the stitching, make sure that you maintain the square nature of the bias. Don't pull the stitching so hard that you're going to pull in the walls of the bias and ruin the ribua of the bias. But again, the critical point that I want to make here is that according to Rashi, what do we learn from this Brisa in Menachos? That when the Brisa says, Tefillin meruba, halacha l'Moshe miSinai, what's the halacha l'Moshe miSinai? That the bias proper, the ketzitza, the part that holds the parshias, has to be square. Does the titura have to be square? I don't know. How about the stitches? Take a look at the bottom of my tefillin, these tefillin over here. You see the stitches? The stitches form a square. Do those stitches have to be perfectly squared? Or could those stitches be haphazard? How about over here on the top of the tefillin? This is an older pair of tefillin. Nowadays they tend to paint the gidon so the gidon don't show up as white. Over here you can see the stitching. The stitching on top also forms a square. Does that have to be square? According to Rashi, we don't really see that in the Brisa. Now there's an interesting Tosfos here in Menachos. Tosfos says, Yesh she'ein merabin ela b'makom moshavan. Tosfos says, based on this Brisa, Tosfos says, there are many who only make the titura square. They hold that the titura has to be square, but not the bias. Where? How do they get that? Because Tosfos is learning, what does the Brisa say? The Brisa says, Tefillin meruba'is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. We don't know what it means. Comes along with Papa, betifran uba alachsoinan. The stitching has to be square. Tosfos understands that means where the stitching is. Where's the stitching? On the titura. And Tosfos' titura was like our titura. Tosfos' titura extended beyond the bias. So Tosfos seems to be understanding the Brisa and Rav Papa that the whole Brisa is talking about the bottom of the tefillin. It's talking about the titura. It's not talking about the top. So Tosfos says there are those yesh she'ein merabin ela b'makom moshavan, There are those that only make square the bottom of the tefillin. They don't make the top of the tefillin square. Taisa says, V'shemot tzarech habatim merubain. Maybe the bias also has to be meruba. He says shema. V'chein bias shal yad. Maybe the bias of the shal yad. Maybe the bias also has to be meruba. Uktsas hoya nireh deloi boy merubais ela b'toifran ubalach sainan k'maishem afarish Rav Papa. But he says, but from the Gemara, from the Brisa, it's a little bit mashma that it's only the bottom that has to be squared. The Brisa doesn't seem to mention anything about the top. The Brisa seems to be talking about the bottom, not about the top. The truth is that if we go over to the Gemara in Megillah, the Gemara in Megillah seems more meduyik in a way, that to say that the Brisa is really talking about the bottom, about the titura, and not the top. Why? Because the Gemara in Megillah, the reason this comes up in Megillah is for the following reason. The Mishnah in Megillah, Chafei Amid Aleph, no, not Chafei Amid Aleph, I'm sorry, Chav Daled Amid Beis. The Mishnah in Megillah, Chav Daled Amid Beis says as follows. Ha'oset tfilasai agula. Somebody who makes the bias of his tefillin round. Sakana, it's dangerous. Ve'ein ba mitzvah, and it's not a mitzvah. Okay, why is it a sakana? So Rashi explains that what the Gemara is talking about is tefillin where the entire bias, the top, the titura, it's made round or like an oval, so that at the bottom where it rests on the head, it might be pointy. Says the Mishnah, that's a sakana. You know why? Let's say you're wearing tefillin. Remember, they wore tefillin all day. Let's say you're wearing your tefillin and you're running, and you bop your head into something. The bottom of the tefillin could penetrate your skull. So the Mishnah says you make your tefillin round, it's a sakana, and you're not yoitza. Says the Mishnah, you're not yoitza. Comes along the Gemara, and the Gemara says, Lema Tanina, let's say that this Mishnah is a Mishnah that teaches us a halacha to lahad Tanu Rabbanan. Let's say this Mishnah is teaching us the same halacha that we learned in the Brisa. Which Brisa? The Brisa on Menachos, Lamed Hey Amid Aleph. Because the Gemara in Megillah quotes the Brisa, the Tanu Rabbanan, Tefillin Merubayis halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So what's the Gemara saying? The Gemara is saying like this. The Gemara over here is saying, we have a Brisa in Menachos, where the Brisa in Menachos on Lamed Hey Amid Aleph tells us that Tefillin Merubayis are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We have over here a Mishnah in Megillah that tells us that if you make your Tefillin agula, it's a sakana and you're not yoitza. So the Mishnah in Megillah seems to be telling me the same exact halacha as the Brisa in Menachos. That's the Gemara's kasha here on Chavdal and Amid Beis. And for the Gemara, no. The Gemara says, no. The Gemara says, Amar Papa, Masnisin da avida ki amguza. The Gemara says, no. You don't see the same halacha. You know why? Because what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah here in Megillah says that if somebody makes his tefillin agula, it's a sakana. Why is it a sakana? Because if he bops into a wall, it could penetrate his skull. Obviously then, the Mishnah in Megillah is talking about where the bottom of the tefillin are round. Not only is the top of the tefillin round, but the bottom is round. Kind of like this picture that I made over here, this oval. It's pointy at the bottom, and that's why the Mishnah says it's a sakana, because it can penetrate the skull. But how about if you make the tefillin like this picture over here? How about if you make the picture so that you have a flat, square titura, and you have a sphere, you have a ball on top? In that case, you don't have the Mishnah's problem. There's no sakana. It's not going to penetrate your head. The bottom is flat. The bottom is not round. So says Rava, no. This Mishnah does not teach us the same halacha as the Brisa in Menachos. The Mishnah tells me you can't make it like an almond. You can't make it oval so that it's round on top and pointy at the bottom. But you want to make it round on top and flat on the bottom? From the Mishnah, it would seem that that's okay. Comes along the Brisa in Menachos, and the Brisa in Menachos says, no, it's got to be flat on bottom. How do you know that that's what the Brisa says? Because of Rav Papa. Because the Brisa in Menachos says, Tefillin Merubayis halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Amar of Papa, what does that mean? Betifron, where you stitch it. It's got to be square where you stitch it. Where is that? The Titura. The Titura is the part that has to be square. So here we have the source for the halacha of Merubayis. This is how we know that the tefillin have to be Merubayis. And we have this question. What exactly is the Brisa talking about? Is the Brisa talking about the top of the tefillin, the ketzitza proper? Is it talking about the bottom of the tefillin, the titura? But then there's another option. Maybe it's not even talking about the titura. Maybe it's specifically talking about what Rav Papa says. B'toifron, the stitches. Maybe it just means that the box formed by the stitching has to be a square. So there we have another option. Rabbi say it's a very complicated machlokes rishonim. I told you Rashi, I told you Tosfos. There's also the Rambam. There's also a Mordechai. The Mordechai is the Rishon that seems to say the most clear that no. When the Brisa says Tefillin Merubayis, what do you think it means? It means the ketzitza. What's Tefillin? Tefillin is the bias that holds the parsha. So the pshuta, the milsa of the Brisa, when the Brisa says Tefillin Merubayis halacha l'Moshe miSinai, is that the ketzitza has to be squared. Comes along Rav Papa, and Rav Papa adds on to the Brisa. And he says, not only does the ketzitza have to be square, also b'toifron, also the stitching has to be squared. U'bila'ach soinon. Not only does it have to be square, but it has to be so square that the diagonal has to be the proper diagonal. What does that mean? I'll tell you what that means. What that means is like this. I'm going to bring you bad memories from your geometry classes. Let's imagine we have a square. Okay? Here I have a beautiful square on my paper. As you can see up here, here we have this length, this leg of the square, this side is 6 inches. This side of the square is also 6 inches. Now, I didn't mark the other two, but all 4 sides of the square are 6 inches. Now, if I want to know if this square is a perfect square, if I take a ruler and I measure all 4 sides, and I get the same measurement on all 4 sides, does that tell me that it's a square? No, it doesn't have to be a square. You know why? Because maybe it's not a square. Maybe it's a parallelogram, right? Forget for the moment all the lines that are traversing the middle of this shape. But this shape is not a square. Now, you do see the numbers that I marked over here. Again, all 4 sides are 6 inches. If you take my ruler and measure, all 4 sides of this parallelogram are 6 inches each. But as you can see, it's not a square, right? It's a diamond. It's not a square. Now, the key way that you know it's not a square is, we all know, if you want to know if a square is a true square or not, what you do is you make a triangle, okay? You make a right triangle so that you have this 6-inch side is one side of the triangle, this 6-inch side is another side of the triangle, and then you make the hypotenuse. You make this leg of the triangle right here, and then you compare the length of the hypotenuse to the length of the 2 other legs of the triangle. And we know, sai from Chazal and sai from our knowledge of geometry, we know what the ratio between the 2 legs, the 2 sides, and the hypotenuse is. And that is, in the words of Chazal, that the hypotenuse of a perfect square is 2/5 larger than the other 2 legs of the triangle. So I took my ruler and I measured. This is 6 inches. This leg over here is 6 inches. The hypotenuse is 2/5 larger. It's 8.4 inches. So in the words of Chazal, the way Chazal write that is, and it's a Gemara in Sukkah, Kol amsa b'ribua, whenever you have a square, an amma squared, where every side of the square is an amma, if it's a true square, Amsa utrei chumsha ba'alachsoina. It will be an amma and 2/5 on its diagonal. So you want to know if a square is a square? What you do is you measure two sides, and you see the measurement of the two sides. Then you measure the diagonal. If it's a perfect square, the diagonal will always be 2/5 larger than the sides of the square. If you get that ratio, you know you have a perfect square. So what does Rav Papa mean when Rav Papa says, Tefillin merubais halacha l'Moshe misinai, and then Rav Papa says, ubela achsoina? What he means is, he's telling you that tefillin have to be square, but when you want to know if your tefillin are square, it's not enough to take a ruler, measure one side. Let me get it on the camera. Measure one side, then measure another side and see that they're the same. It's not even enough to measure all four sides and see that they're all the same. If you want to know whether or not the tefillin are merubais, you need to measure the diagonal. If you measure the diagonal and you find out that the diagonal is 2/5 longer than the sides, then you know that your tefillin are merubais. Okay, so now I've given you a lot of background here. We see where the halacha comes from, that the tefillin have to be merubais. We see that there's a lot of raid in the Rishonim, specifically what part of the tefillin have to be merubais. And now we discussed how you have to measure to make sure that they are merubais. Now, I'll just give you a heads up and let you know that lahalacha, we paskin that everything has to be merubah. So the ketzitza has to be merubah. And that means that when we have a pair of tefillin, we have to measure each side. And each side has to be the same. And we have to measure the diagonal. And we have to see that the diagonal is 2/5 longer than the sides, so that we know that we have a true square. Now, do you have to take a micrometer? Do you have to measure with a micrometer and go down to the hundredths of a centimeter? The Rishiva Zatzal, Rav Moshe Zechet Tzaddik V'Kodesh L'Vrach, and the Igris writes, no, absolutely not. You do not have to. It's as much as you can measure. Kira'osei Nayim, you look at it with your eye. You take a ruler, which is very common. You measure with a ruler, but you don't have to go get fancy micrometers and everything else and do it down to 7, 8, 9 digits and decimals. No, you do not have to do that. And the Rishiva brings a raya. The Rishiva's raya is from what I just told you, the Gemara in Sukkah. The Gemara in Sukkah says, what's the ratio between the diagonal and the side of the square? The diagonal is 2/5 longer than the side of the square. That's not precisely accurate. The precise relationship between the diagonal and the side is 1.41414, right? It's the square root of 2 is the precise ratio. So the Rishiva Zatzal says Chazal could have written the precise ratio. They could figure out the precise ratio the same way we can. Why did they write 2/5? Because we're not mechuyev to be mitzamtzim to that degree. We don't have to get it to that level of exactitude. The Rishiva Zatzal goes so far as to say, if you have one bias that was measured with a micrometer, and you see that it's exactly precise, and you have another bias that was not measured with a micrometer, there is no hidur whatsoever in the one that was measured with a micrometer over the one that was not measured with a micrometer. Because we're not mechuyev to go down to that level of exactitude. So, the bias has to be square. The tefiris, the box formed by the stitching, has to be precisely square. The stitching has to be square on top of the titura, and the box formed by the stitching has to be square on the bottom of the titura. So all of these parts of the tefillin have to be square. Then the titura itself, the base of the tefillin, the titura itself has to be square. Now you're looking at my tefillin right now, and you're saying, Rabbi Weiss, what do you mean the titura is square? That is not a square, that's a rectangle. I mean, this over here, the top, if I measure over here, this is 5 centimeters. And if I measure this side over here, this is just about almost 7 centimeters, 6.5 centimeters. So what do you mean the Titura is square? No, Rabbi Isai, the Titura is square, because as we're going to learn today, pay close attention to the Titura. Do you see, here's my little pointer here. Do you see over here this notch? See? It gets notched in, and then it comes straight over here. And so too on this side. There's a notch going in, and then it comes straight over here. That straight line, Rabbi Isai, I'll put my ruler up against it. I should do it from the top, not from the bottom. That straight line that is formed by the flat base of the notch, that is considered the end of the Titura. And the reason those notches are made is to make this flat spot here and this flat spot here to delineate the fourth side of the box of the Titura. So you've got one side here, one side here, one side here, and the fourth side of the box of the Titura is here. And that box has to be merubah. So this has to be merubah. The box formed by the stitching has to be merubah. The box of the stitching on top has to be merubah. The ketzitza has to be merubah. We go all in. Everything's got to be merubah. Okay. Now, against that backdrop, that 26-minute backdrop, and now I'm seriously beginning to wonder or doubt whether I'm getting nearly as far as I thought we were going to get in today's shir. But all we could do is try. Against that backdrop, let's read this inside, and hopefully now it will go very, very simple. So, we're on the top line of the Shulchan Aruch, Dun Gimel Lamed Beis, Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Lamed Tes, says the Mechaber. Tefillin, the Tefillin, Bein Shel Rosh, both by the Shel Rosh, Bein Shel Yad, and by the Shel Yad, Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, we have a Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, Sheyiu Merubais, that they must be square. Now, says the Mechaber, what has to be square? Says the Mechaber, B'tifron, they're stitching, Uba'al Achsainan, and they have to be square on their diagonal. First thing I want to point out is that at this point, the only part of the tefillin that the Mechaber is saying has to be square is the stitching. So the Mechaber right now is going like those Rishonim that say that when the Bryce in Menachos says Tefillin Merubais Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, and then Rav Papa or Rabba or Rava say B'tifron, it's a pirush on the Brisa. What does it mean, Tefillin Merubais? It means the stitching. And again, the simple way to understand that is the box formed by the stitching. That's what has to be square. That's what the Mechaber says so far. And what's Ubalach Sainon? That means that it has to be squared to the extent that the diagonal, when we want to measure and see if the box formed by the stitching is a true square, we got to measure the diagonal and see the ratio between the diagonal and the sides and make sure that it's 2/5 longer. And so says the Mechaber. Explains the Mechaber, Tahainu, what does this mean, Ubalach Sainon? Sheyu Ribuan Mechuvan, that the square should be exact. Arkai Kerachbai, the length and the width have to be precisely the same. Kidei, in order that, Sheyia Lehem Oisai Alachsain, so that the square should have the diagonal Sha'amru Chazal, that is defined by Chazal as the diagonal of a true square, which is Kol Amsa Beribua. Whenever you have an Amma square, Amsa Utrei Chumsha Ba'alachsaina, the diagonal will be an Amma in 2/5, because the diagonal of a true square is always 2/5 longer than the sides of a true square. So what did the Mechaber say over here so far in Sif Lamed Tes? He said, Rabbi side is a halacha l'Moshe Misinai, the tefillin have to be square. Where do they have to be square? Be-tifron, by their stitching. To what level do they have to be square? They have to be precisely squared. How do we measure if they're precisely squared? We measure the diagonal. What does the diagonal of the square have to be? It has to be the diagonal defined by Chazal of a perfect square, which is that the diagonal is 2/5 longer than the sides of the square. Now let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Now, I'm going to give you a heads up. I showed you a picture with a lot of very complicated lines. We're going to need this diagram for a very vague piece of terminology in the Chavetz Chaim. I hope I understand correctly what the Chavetz Chaim says. It's not so much negei lahalacha, it's just negei to understand the way the Chavetz Chaim writes it. I worked on this very hard. I hope I'm truly understanding how the Chavetz Chaim wrote it, but we shall see. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut in Kofayin Gimel. Sheyu merubais, the tefillin have to be square. Ve'im loy asa merubais, if the tefillin are not square. Ma'akiv b'di'eved, this is ma'akiv, even b'di'eved, the tefillin are not kosher. And he brings this down from the Rambam, Perek Gimel, Michilchos Tefillin, Ayin Sham, where the Rambam tells us that there are 8 halacha l'moshe b'sinais in tefillin, and one of them is that the tefillin need to be merubah, and since it's a halacha l'moshe b'sinai, it is ma'akev, and the tefillin are not kosher if it's not merubah. Umikal Makom, nevertheless, says the Mishnah Berurah, im ein loy tefillin acherim, if you do not have another pair of tefillin, yanichem le'es ata b'loy bracha, you should put these tefillin that are not merubah, you should put them on without a bracha. And then if you get other tefillin that are merubah, yanichem, you should put them on with the bracha. V'ayin b'bir halacha, and he sends us to the bir halacha. Now, one thing at a time. First of all, when the Mishnah Berurah says over here that if you don't have tefillin that are merubah, you should put them on without a bracha, right after telling us a Rambam that says that if they're not merubah, it's ma'akiv. If it's ma'akiv, why are we putting it on without a bracha? The answer is a halacha that we learned previously in the halachas of daled minim, where we learned that if you don't have daled minim that are kosher, you should take daled minim that are pasul without a bracha. Why? Shaloi tishtakach toras daled minim, so that we should not forget the mitzvah of daled minim. So if you don't have kosher tefillin, you don't have tefillin that are merubah, put on tefillin that are not merubah without a bracha. Shaloi tishtakach toras tefillin. You shouldn't forget the mitzvah of tefillin. Now, the Mishnah Berurah sent us to a bir halacha, which I don't have time to do. It's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. Dibra Maslo Shiyu Merubais, where he goes into the complexities of some of what we just spoke about, which is, well, which part of the tefillin are not merubah? And does it matter which part of the tefillin are not merubah? Are they all ma'akiv? Or are only some of them ma'akiv? If the bias is not merubah, is that ma'akiv? If the tfiras are merubah? If the stitching is merubah and the bias is not merubah, is that ma'akiv? Maybe that's not ma'akiv. So he goes through it in this bir halacha. But lamaisa, over here in the Mishnah Berurah, he just says, it's not merubah, then you put on without a bracha. Okay. Kovayin Daled. The Mechaber said it's halacha l'moshe b'sinai sheyu ribuan, that the square of the tefillin should be mechuven, it should be precise. Which square? What square are we talking about? At this point, all we read in the Mechaber was sheyu merubois b'tifron. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah Kovayin Daled sheyu ribuan shel hatfiros. Over here, the Mechaber is still addressing specifically the square formed by the stitches. Venerally Pashit, and the Mishnah Berurah says it seems obvious to him that when we speak about the box formed by the stitching, the box formed by the stitching has to be square, bein lamaila ubein lamata, both on top of the bias, right? We could see the stitching on the top, bein lamata, also on the bottom of the bias. Chavetz Chaim says, even though b'di'eved, I'm not sure. It's not clear to me, b'di'eved, do both the top and the bottom have to be square? But certainly lechatchila, we should be careful that the stitching should be square, both on top and on bottom. Now we get to a complex Mishnah Berurah, which is going to require our complex diagram. Okay. So the Mechaber told us the square has to be a perfect square. How do we know if it's a perfect square? The way we know it's a perfect square is be'alachsoinon, by measuring the diagonal of the square and looking at the ratio between the diagonal and the sides. And the ratio has to be that the diagonal is 2/5 longer than the sides. And then we know that we have a perfect square. Says the Mishnah Berurah over here in Ois Katan Kuf Ayin Hey, Pirush. What's the explanation of this? Beribua Gamur. It has to be a perfect square. She'arkai kerachbai mamish, so that the length and the width are perfectly aligned. They're perfectly the same. Shiaru Chachamim, the Chazal measured, Kol Hashir Sheyeshlai, whatever the measurement of the sides of the square are, Yeshlai Ba'alachsain, this square is going to have in its diagonal, Shnei Chamashim Noisaf al Oisai Hashir. The diagonal is always going to be 2/5 longer than the sides of the square. So in the diagram that I gave you, the sides of the square are 6 inches. The diagonal is going to be 8.4 because the diagonal is always going to be 2/5 longer than the sides. V'gam kan tsar sheyeh meruba mamish. And over here too, that's the square that we need when we want to see that the stitching of the tefillin are meruba. We need a perfect square where the diagonal of the square is 2/5 longer than the sides. Aval, however, im lo yeh meruba mamish, if the square is not a true square, let's say it's a parallelogram, it's not a true square, lo yeh ba'alachson shaloi kishir shnei chamashim toisafos, then the diagonal is not going to be 2/5 longer than the sides. Elashir acher, it's going to have a different measurement. What measurement will it have? Well, that depends what the shape is and which diagonal you're measuring. Va'al kain, and therefore, and this is where we get a little complex, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me. Va'al kain, and therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, how should you measure the ribua of the tefillin? Yimdadenu ba'arba kavim, you're going to have to measure 4 distinct lines. V'yeda, and by doing so, you will know Imu Meruba, if it's truly Meruba. You're going to have to measure, you're going to have to take 4 measurements. Which 4 measurements? Let's see. Dahainu, Tchila Yimdoid Kav Echad Ba'oirech. First measure one side of the square on its length. The Kav Echad Ba'roichav, and one side of the square on its width. Sheyeh Shaveh, and see that they're the same. Okay, what does that mean? So we'll snap a measurement here. Well, let's go back to my square. What we'll do is we'll snap a measurement here, and we'll see that it's 6 inches. Then we'll snap a measurement here, and we'll see that that's 6 inches. So far we know that the length and the width of the square are identical. So it's a 6 by 6 square. But we still don't know if it's a perfect square. What do we have to do? So far, the Mishnah Berurah said we need to measure 4 lines. So far we measured 2. But we still don't know if it's a perfect square. What are the next 2 measurements that we have to take? Says the Mishnah Berurah. However, by snapping the 2 measurements that you just snapped, by measuring one side on the length and one side on the width, you still don't know that it's a square. Why? Because, and this is the line that gave me such a hard time, Shema be'emtsa'ei shaveh. First, I'm just going to teach the words. Maybe there's a mathematician out there who has a different pshat than me. Shema be'emtsa'ei shaveh. Maybe the square is going to have the same measurement in the middle, ubitztadav misma'it, but on the sides it got smaller. What I believe the Mishnah Berurah means is as follows, and I'm just going to draw some, if I have a clean paper, I'm going to draw something just very pashut, which I didn't think to draw before. I hope it'll come out clear on the camera. Let's see. I'm so sorry, Rabbi Isai. I hate when I do this in the middle of the share. It's really not fair, but just please bear with me. How do I even do this? Please bear with me. Please bear with me. Please bear with me. Forget it. It didn't even work. Okay, I'll go back to my complicated diagram. I'm sorry. The Mishnah Berurah is saying like this. You measured one side over here, and you got 6 inches. You measured another side over here, and you got 6 inches. Does that mean you have a perfect square? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Why? Ach, shema be'emtzai shaveh. Maybe in the middle, its tak is still true. It's 6 inches. You see this middle line that I made over here? You see that line, the line above the ruler? That's also a 6-inch line. It cuts across the middle of the square, and it's also 6 inches. Why? Because it's parallel to this leg up here. And if this is 6 inches, this is also going to be 6 inches. Anywhere in the box where you draw a line that's parallel to any of the 6-inch lines, it's going to be 6 inches. This line also is 6 inches. This line also traverses the middle of the box, and it's also 6 inches. So, what do you have over here? You have the sides of the square are all 6 inches. You could draw lines cutting across the middle of the square, and they're also 6 inches. But it's still not a square. You know how I know it's not a square? Because measure the diagonals. If I measure the diagonals, this diagonal is not 2/5 longer than the sides. It's a lot longer than that. That diagonal over here, right? This diagonal above the ruler is 9 3/4. That's not 2/5 longer than 6. It's a lot longer. And the other diagonal that I made over here is 6 3/4. This diagonal over here is 6 3/4. Because what did I do? I took my box and I stretched it into a diamond, right? It's no longer a square. Instead, what I did was, and I'll just try to graphically illustrate it on the square. If I go ahead, you see the arrows at the corners, right? If I take the box at the corners over here and I pull it in the direction of the arrows, what's going to happen? I'm pulling those two corners out, and these two corners are going to contract, right? These two corners are going to move inward. If these two corners are pulled outward, these two corners are going to pull inward. And I think that's what the Mishnah Berurah means when the Mishnah Berurah says, Ach, even if you measure the sides and you get the sides all being even, and even if you draw straight parallel lines traversing the middle, and you also get even. So this is 6 inches, right? And this is 6 inches, and this is 6 inches, and this is 6 inches. You still don't have a square. You know why? Because maybe be'emtzai shaveh, maybe in the middle it's still even, but what's his words? Ubitstadav mismait, but on its sides it has become contracted, right? The sides over here, when I went ahead and I misshaped the box by pulling out these corners, by making this diagonal longer, this diagonal became smaller. So bitstadav, on its sides, yismait, it became narrower. When I pull out this, it pulls in these sides. So that's what he means over here. Maybe even though the sides are all 6 inches, it doesn't mean you have a square. You have a parallelogram, but it's not a square. So again, if I read it inside, what the Mishnah Berurah is saying, what do you have to know in order to know that it is a square? Valkain, therefore, yimdadenu barba kavim, you have to snap 4 measurements. There are 4 lines you have to measure. V'yeda, and then you'll know imhu meruba if it's square. Dahainu, tchila yimdoid kavechad ba'oirech v'kavechad ba'roichav. First, take 2 measurements. One side in the length, one side in the width. that's 2 lines, and see that they are the same. Sheyeh shaveh. But you still don't know if it's a square, because Shema be'emtzai shaveh, maybe in the middle it's still the same as the sides, ubitzadav misma'et, but on 2 sides the square became narrower because it's no longer a square, it's a parallelogram. Lachein, therefore, what do you have to do to measure now to make sure it's a square? Yimdadenu oid b'shnei kavim, measure another 2 lines ba'alachsoinai, on the diagonal. Measure one diagonal and another diagonal and see that they are both the same. You don't even have to know really if the diagonals are 2/5 longer than the sides. All you have to know is that the 2 diagonals have the same measurement. If all 4 sides have the same measurement and the diagonals have the same measurement, then you know you have a perfect square. Because if you didn't have a perfect square, if instead you had this parallelogram, then the 2 diagonals would not be the same. You'd have one long diagonal, right? This one is 9 3/4, and you'd have one short diagonal, which is 6 3/4. So lachein yimdadenu oid b'shnei kavim ba'alachsoinai shiyu shavim shnei kavei ha'alachsoin gam kein. Okay. Wow. I thought we were going to get a lot further. I'm going to stop now because we're already 46 minutes in. Maybe I'll do another share yet today and try to get further. Wow, and how silly of me. I thought maybe we would do 2 pages. All right, it's the way it is. Listen, we're learning and we're going as fast as we can, trying to keep it as clear as possible. I hope that was clear. I tried. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The exclusive limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah said, Yeshua for first parnasah shtuchim to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the BS Gal Tzedek. B'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.